Welcome to Farm to School Northeast, a podcast where we explore the creative ways that local food is getting into school cafeterias and how food system education is playing out in classrooms and school gardens across the Northeast. Today, we have an opportunity to sit down with Fatima Seck. Fatima manages a school garden at the Mel King South End Academy in Boston, Massachusetts. She is entering her third season as the school gardener at Mel King and is a proponent of school gardens being a hub for social emotional learning and cultural education. Her farm to school wish is that school gardens are integrated deeply into school cultures, beyond science education, to therapeutic services, arts and humanities, teacher, leadership, education, and more. Welcome, Fatima.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very grateful to be here.
All right. So, Fatima, can you introduce yourself to the listeners and, in particular, share how your work and interests are connected to Farm to School?
Absolutely. My name is Fatima Seck. I come to urban agriculture and school garden education after having worked in arts education through museums and also in early childhood education. So I bring a kind of strong background in what museums education is all about, which is really about exchange and ideas through art, cultural exchange, cultural history, and then what early childhood education is all about, which is social emotional learning. And with the littles, the really littles, are really thinking about, how can we teach them to build awareness about their own emotional lives and how to communicate it. So those were kind of my building blocks of coming into working at a school garden, where I started off actually just as a volunteer, and I just really fell in love with working for the very first time actually managing a school garden. So you don't need experience to do it if that's something that's interesting to you. I am now coming into my third season at this school garden, which was founded originally by the science teachers and over time has been handed off into someone who's into me in a full-time role and a couple other people in between. But I'm really interested in kind of bridging all of the things that I mentioned together. So bringing this like arts education, cultural perspective to school garden education. I think sometimes we can really corner school garden education really into the science fields. And I'm really big on like, how can we connect this to literature? How can we connect this to the humanities, to history, to arts and music education. We grow like Paul Robeson tomatoes, and we can learn all about jazz in the garden, for example. So, and also really think about how school gardens can be a really valuable tool for learning social emotional skills. It's kind of built into the pedagogy of learning into a garden, learning in a garden. So there's my background.
So, you have a passion for using the school garden as a place for social emotional learning. Can you first describe for our listeners what social emotional learning is, and then
Yeah.
speak to why gardens, whether they're indoors or outdoors,
Yeah.
are important places for social emotional growth?
Absolutely. Great question. For me, social emotional learning, or what it means to have strong social emotional knowledge, is basically it's about your skills and your ability to kind of manage the weather of of life, So managing your emotions, knowing how to regulate them, how to confront and face things that frustrate you, how to confront and face things that are challenging to you, deciding what's important to you, practicing skills like discernment. I think a sign of strong social emotional knowledge is a student's ability to have some level of resilience to the things that are inevitable in life, and also an ability to deeply appreciate the things that are also inevitable in life that are beautiful. So, we talk about a lot about things like emotional regulation, learning how to manage kind of sensory overload, learning how to communicate, and both listen better, but also communicate our internal worlds a little bit better. So I think communication and emotional regulation are really fundamental skills, but also so are other more inward facing things like patience and, managing frustration and things like that. Our goals as educators in trying to really create, or raise students who have strong social emotional skills, is a student who can meet life with resilience, with an openness, without shutting themselves down, and is able to communicate through it. And I think the reason that a garden is a great place to develop that type of education is because it kind of makes you. It kind of it's full of metaphors for life. It's kind of a little arena, like a little version of what we experience in the larger world. And I think through a school garden, through the act of planting a tomato, if you want to eat that tomato, you just got to wait for it. There's really just no way around it. So through this education, I think more so than other kinds of education, which might involve standardization, might involve assessment and testing. There's no testing in a garden. There's no assessment. So it's really about learning life skills. There's no other thing to do. And it's really about, I think play is also a really big part of social emotional learning. I think play, the ability to play is a big sign of strong social emotional skills, but also play can help us access stronger social emotional learning skills because play is also an arena where conflict happens and we need to practice patience and learn how to express ourselves and communicate. Um, but in a garden, I think if we can really, as educators, really walk young people through how just in this small act of planting a seed and the small act of doing something like weeding, weeding is about the skill of discernment. How do you make a decision in your life? What is important, what it's not? Crop planning is about value systems. Crop planning is about what's important and how do we create balance between the different things that are important to us. So if we as educators and as people, if we can kind of find the bigger picture and really make meaning through working in the garden, we can really tap into a lot of potential for amazing social emotional education.
Can you share a few examples of maybe some students who you have seen have significant personal growth in a garden, and like what were some signs you saw of this positive change?
Yeah. I can think of a couple different examples. I think one skill that I felt really grateful to see and happy to see in a young person in the garden. This is a student who has kind of grown a fondness for being in the garden and for being in the garden space. And I think with that fondness is really invested in it and feels it's a space that where they have agency, where they have helped create it. I think a lot of young people don't feel a sense of agency in their lives. And so another thing that a school garden can offer is this opportunity to say, like, I grew something or I painted something at my school in a similar way that an art classroom can do. Um, and this student, is someone who's learning to practice emotional regulation, especially around anger. Um, and I think it was interesting to watch them over time be able to manage their anger, especially in the garden, in a way that didn't involve any kind of physical aggression in the space. So, we talk a lot about how everything is life. Everything really is a little, even this little plant, this little weed that we have to be discerning around is still life that we have to respect and honor. And I think there's this experience of watching a young person choose to go to the garden to regulate themselves and choose to go to the garden to cool down, but not act out, not to destroy, not to lash out, but really to just cool down for me demonstrated that how a school garden can be a really vital part of creating a culture of emotional regulation for students. Sometimes we do just need to exit a situation. And I think through the kind of investment that working in a school garden with a school gardener or a science teacher or an art teacher can do for a young person, then it also creates a sense of investment where they can regulate themselves in a peaceful way, which is a very important skill in life. We need to know how to regulate ourselves in a way that doesn't inflict harm to others. Other examples I can think of is a practice that we try to adopt, which is practicing gratitude when it comes to, growing food and planting things and recognizing life, and watching the young people take on these habits. We say a lot, especially with middle schoolers, that, we're just planting seeds that we hope can last over time. And I think in this act of it begins as something that is external. It's asked of their teacher. This is a practice that I set up of like we always give thanks or we say a kind word is what we is what we do when we plant our seeds in. But over time, they kind of take it up on their own and it becomes a little bit of a mental habit. And we can hope that, I think for me, when we talk about saying something kind to the seed, I'm trying to teach the skill of like set deliberate intentions, set mindful intentions, and so we can hope that that skill can translate over time. So those are a couple examples of how we can see students both choose to use the garden to regulate, choose make it a part of their emotional life in a way, and their emotional life at the school, but also how the little habits that we try to instill at the garden at the smaller scale over time, they take on these habits as much as they begin as something from the teacher.
So you're giving students so much. You're giving them an opportunity to invest in something external to themselves that they maybe
Yes.
haven't had that opportunity, giving them agency,
Yeah,
empowering them to kind of cooperatively take care of this space in the school.
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. One of my favorite like scenes or favorite moments in the garden is so everything we grow goes directly to the soup kitchen next door. And we specifically the food pantry next door. And it was just really amazing. After, we had to spend a little time learning these different skills of how to harvest, how to wash things, how to bundle them up and make them, presentable to give to someone. And initially, I'm there kind of managing a lot or teaching new skills, but there was this moment where I could just step back and they were just this wonderful collaborative ecosystem of I will harvest this, you will wash this, I will bundle this, and I will hand this over. They were able to like kind of place their personalities where they would thrive best. The more introverted students were on harvesting duty. The more extroverted students were super happy to like hand people, cilantro over the fence. And so yes, I love that you noted, that it becomes this really collaborative environment and they do get to feel a sense of being a part of something larger than themselves, which boosts confidence, the feeling of really giving to someone. And we talked earlier about this idea of patience. It's one thing to be patient for your own piece of cilantro, but I think the feeling of I planted this, really being able to make this connection between like I planted this seed, and when I was in sixth grade, and now I'm in seventh grade, and I'm giving a bundle of vegetables to someone who will tell me that this is the only reason she could get these vegetables this time. I think that creates a sense of it's worth the wait sometimes, which is a skill we are teaching many young people and also really helps with their sense of self-worth.
So we know that educators and counselors and school staff are very busy, right,
Yeah,
with their standards, with the curriculum they have.
yeah,
And so that sometimes keeps people from getting to participate if they have another role in the building. And I think that another thing is that some people just don't know how to get started. Like they
yeah.
might really want to participate, but they're just not sure. So I know you have so many, but could you share a few of your favorite go-to activities in the garden that might feel like an easy lift for someone
Yeah.
who is new at this?
Absolutely. Well, I'll also say that you can learn actually very similar kind of skills from houseplants, and that can be kind of a good halfway medium if, an outdoor school garden doesn't quite, there might not be capacity for that. Or even like herbs on a windowsill, there can be these kind of smaller, just starting small, really. You can really, right now, what we're doing this year is having each class really just work with one garden bed. So I would really recommend, just starting really small. You don't have to start with a whole garden. Everything we have to say about a garden can be expressed on one bed. You still have to weed one bed. You still have to prune tomatoes on one bed, and you can actually grow a really interesting constellation and ecosystem of crops in just one garden bed. So I would absolutely suggest, starting small, starting with herbs and things that grow quickly and can be reharvested quickly and used in very many different ways. I think, there's something really rewarding about fruit, but it takes fruit, including things like peppers and tomatoes. But they take a lot more kind of time and labor to grow. And sometimes a good access point, especially when you think about how to get young people excited about bringing these ingredients into their actual diets. I can find sometimes a tomato is like, they'll try it. But scallion cream cheese, they will eat all of it. So, we can kind of start there. So I think starting really small, and, working with other teachers to really make the lift lighter. I think, to go back to what we were talking about earlier of how this can be an interdisciplinary effort. So instead of all of it falling on a science teacher, I think if the science teacher and the art teacher and the English teacher get together and each do a third, then we can work together that way. So in terms of activities in the garden, for me, I'm a big fan of this concept of parallel play, and this idea of just doing doing the work, doing what needs to be. I don't often have separate activities for them, but it's like, here's what I'm going to do today, and I'm going to bring you into how you can do this with me. So it's really about practicing a pedagogy that is constantly bringing them into the fold of the work you're already doing, and then they feel a sense of authority in the garden. We have done things like, crafts, I think are always a great way, decorating garden beds. Sometimes we'll like plant crops in the shape of different veggies, so we can kind of tie that into math a little bit. But through parallel play and through just having young people accompany us and the work we would have already done, this is also kind of a Montessori framework a little bit too of accessing play through real life scenarios. recently we planted actually seeds for like Aunt Lou's tomatoes. They're seeds actually that are from the Underground Railroad. And they just did that with me. We talked as we planted, we talked a little bit about, what do you remember of the Underground Railroad? Like what have you learned about that? And what does it mean to hold these seeds? We talked a lot about what it means to be holding these seeds as the people that we are, and now being in this garden, and what do we want to say to this person who made it possible for us to hold this seed. So I think through parallel play and being willing to kind of work in conjunction with the young people, I think that's another way to be able to access some of that labor and kind of relieve some of the lift, so it doesn't feel like the garden has to be perfect and then you bring the young people in to do an activity. It's more like, oh, we have a ton of weeding to do, so I guess we're all going to weed together, and here's how we're going to make a game out of it.
What's your experience with students who might be really reluctant? How do you get them to overcome that reluctance or that fear or that worry?
Yeah. I'll say when it comes to, bringing young people into the fold, I think that's also what's so exciting about a garden is that there's just so much to do. And I'll always acknowledge that like sometimes touching dirt can just be like a sensory issue, but then we can get gloves there's a great workaround. I think having multiple events happening at the same time can be really helpful. I think sometimes even, we were talking earlier about how to create an atmosphere of social emotional learning, how to create an atmosphere of play. It's also about acknowledging that not all kids play the same way. So one activity that might be really meaningful and generative and exciting and fun and stimulating to one person will just be absolutely not for another. So how can we create an environment where many things are happening at once? And what's amazing about a garden is that there's always different things to do. So one young person who might really want to, it's rare when you meet this young person, but some young people love to weed. They just love it. So you meet that person and, you have them on weeding duty. Some of them really love to water. That can be a really fun sensory activity. Others, I always keep an empty bed that's just for digging. And I find that digging actually a really wonderful access point for everyone, because you don't have to get your hands dirty, but you can still be engaging in this like incredible, or like experiencing this incredible world of earth and soil and finding worms. And I find up to older middle school boys can really play in the dirt for a really long time, which is just quite gorgeous to see, actually. It doesn't just stop, we sometimes stop sandbox play after a certain age, but it's really amazing to see, these boys can be into 13, 14 and really want to dig for worms. And it's like an amazing activity for them. So I think it's about practicing kind of an open pedagogy, one that you can be a little bit flexible. You can triage people, triage young people, triage students, trying to have multiple activities at the same time, I think can be really beneficial. And allowing teaching the young people the skill of how to communicate that they don't want to do something. So I think if we just shut down young people who are getting frustrated because they don't want to do something or they don't feel able to do something, remember sometimes when a young person is acting defensively, sometimes there's like a real fear, real anxiety, or real insecurity in there. And it's coming out as jokes and distracting others, but they're really deeply anxious maybe. So I try to extend grace. Something I always come back to is that a garden is not meant to be a classroom. It's not it doesn't have to have the same expectations. There's no assessment at any point. So I'm not going to force you to do stuff. It's okay. Like if you really don't want to weed right now, like I don't want to weed some days. When it's really hot, I'd rather, sometimes I just want to water or just spend time with the butterflies. I think that's very fair. So, extending that grace, creating an atmosphere of openness, but also making sure that like the garden is still about pleasure in the end. Like I think we can have boundaries and expectations, but it should be fun. It should be fun. And if I'm not making it fun for you, I don't think it's as easy for a young person to access this potential social emotional learning opportunities if they're just associating it with something that, they have to do, or where they have to be in situations that give them anxiety or give them sensory discomfort. So I think practicing that flexibility, but really stressing the value of communication. And it teaches young people that when you communicate, you do get what you need. So I think we have to really build that skill and remind them that communication is really a very powerful tool in our lives.
I love that you set the tone for the garden as fun and exploration that doesn't have an assessment attached. It doesn't have an end result. And
yeah.
What do you think in you are the personality traits that enable you to let go in the garden and make it fun?
I'm an art teacher. I'm an art teacher. So I feel like the domain of or the space of there's no things that someone else can look at it and say there's no point, or there's no assessment at the end. But of course, there is a point, there's a monumental point, which is being alive, like, and doing something creative and doing something that is a beautiful experience for you, and then a beautiful experience, a beautiful something you can gift to someone else. I think this is why gardens are so ripe for social emotional learning, similar to art, because they're not about anything other than just being people and being alive and, and finding our way through, through the things that we're required, that we need, the skills we need to be able to do those things, to do things well and fully. So I think that because my background is in art, which is really about meaning making, is about creativity, is about play and fun. I feel like what we were doing on a small scale, on a piece of paper, is what we're just doing on a bigger scale in the garden. It's interesting because most garden education is very science based, but I'm like not super science. I come from this art space, so I was very like, wow, we can grow these amazing cultural crops. We can grow color. We can make so many. There's endless crafts to make in a garden. Speaking of engaging students who are not feeling the actual plant side, then you can really engage them through art. You can make garden gnomes. You can paint beds. There's all kind of things to be done. But what I'll say is that having a deliberate space for play, and like non-assessed learning during the school day helps over time. It helps them be able to participate more fully in these more slightly more disciplinary forms of learning over time, which I think are still valuable and have their role. But I think this is when it's really valuable to like lean into the play that we can do in the garden. Like lean in. It's we can really embrace it here, and then it can help be a tool for the classroom, because you can say that is garden behavior. Like this is not classroom. There's a difference, and you can really do garden behavior in the garden, especially because, something I always say is that there is age appropriate behavior that is not always classroom appropriate, right? Climbing things, shouting, that's very age appropriate until really like late middle school. But it belongs a little bit better outside and a little better in the garden. So I think really embracing the ethic of play, embracing the ethic of creativity, which is also, I think, the nature of working with the land. Like there's so much you can't control, and there's so much. I mean, you can plant all the beautiful tomatoes you want, and then if those South End bunnies want to get to your rabbits, that's it. There's just nothing you can do. So you kind of have to have a little bit of a oop, and then you can teach young people with those experiences of like, oh, how do I feel disappointed. I really was looking forward to those tomatoes, or I feel really upset and angry because a rabbit ate all my sunflower plants. So what am I going to do about this? You can model that behavior. So gardens aren't built well for being places of standardization. There's so much spontaneity, so much that's not in our control, that we can just surrender to that and make it a play-based space.
I love it that you got the South End bunnies. So,
Yeah.
what do you want everyone to know about Farm to School?
Oh, that it's such a place of expansion for young people. It's such a place. The classroom is so important, but bringing whatever conversation we can create between the outdoors and students learning, it's that thing similar to art where it's kind of, it's not about assessments or standardization. It's really about just being a human being, and I think sometimes when education, the direction of education becomes a little bit more about standardized testing, we kind of lose this really important part of raising children, which is just like really teaching them to flourish in their humanity and flourish in their individuality. And that's what farm to school education is about for me. I used to work with preschoolers outdoors and forest schools, and they just play and they're so large, and it's not really about control or getting certain behavior. It's really just about like, who are you? It's about discovery. Food is such an amazing connector. I think one of my favorite things is, when a young person can make a connection, like we were growing Vietnamese peppers, and a student can make a connection between that and something that they saw in their auntie's house, or then they start telling stories of being at their parents' or grandparents' island, and oh my gosh, I remember these plants from I didn't, or they go home and they tell their parents, we grew basil today, and their parent or their caregiver is like, oh my gosh, bring home some basil. Like it's such an amazing connector. So it also really, it helps young people feel more connected to their world and their families and their past. And it feels like it kind of transcends something that some of learning doesn't always. So when I think about farm to school, I think of it as such a huge area of just true expansion and connection in young people's lives. And just those experiences that kind of just stay with you. They might not be, my students might not have a school garden for their whole, they maybe go somewhere different for high school or for even for middle school. But I think you kind of remember your school garden. I remember I didn't have a school garden growing up, but I think one of my most memorable early childhood experiences was going on a forest walk. We grew up in a city and I just went on this forest walk, and I remember the tour. I was maybe 3 or 4, and the person gave me an earthworm and put it in my hand. And I think that might be one of my earliest memories. So, I think these things really stay with us. And I think that's what we can want as educators, experiences that really stay with our young people.
Well, thank you so much, Fatima. Your energy is just so positive and creative, and you're clearly an artist. And I can't wait personally. I'd love to get out to see your garden and to see you in action in it, because I can already tell what kind of leader you are and facilitator you are for those lucky middle schoolers. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
This podcast is a production of the Northeast Farm to School Collaborative. For more information about this podcast or Farm to School in the Northeast, go to northeastfarmtoschool.org.